Tonight on Ukraine Today, the situation on the battlefield from the most intense sector of the front to the enemy's losses. An optimistic forecast. Why are both the President of the European Commission and the Chief Rabbi of Dnipro predicting that the war in Ukraine will end in 2026? Kyiv, Moscow, Ankara. Could President Zelensky and dictator Putin ever meet face-to-face? And how likely is it that such a meeting would take place in Turkey? Expanding aggression. According to Poland's chief of the general staff, the enemy is already creating conditions that could enable a potential attack on Polish territory. All this and more right now. Hi, I'm Volodymyr Lopchun. This is Ukraine Today. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, hit like, and let's dive into the news. Let's start with the enemy's losses. In the past 24 hours alone, Russian forces lost at least 960 invaders killed or wounded. That brings the total number of Russian occupiers killed or injured since the start of the full-scale invasion to 1,160,380. That's not all. Over the same period, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 13 Russian artillery systems and dozens of other pieces of enemy military equipment. Russian occupation forces have begun using a new type of weapon along the front lines, a modified Iranian-made drone weighing 8 to 9 kilograms. Its flight range is very short, only a few hundred meters, but that doesn't make it harmless. The explosive charge it carries is more than enough to kill a person. Coming up next, a detailed look at what's happening along the front line.
The Russian military-industrial complex is on fire. On the night of November 17th, the Tsinkum plant in the Kursk region caught fire. There are also reports of explosions at the Oriel thermal power plant and several substations. The previous evening, strike UAVs hit a substation in temporarily occupied Donetsk. Preliminarily, it was the Chaikina substation with a capacity of 330 kilowatts.
At 11:40 p.m., the entire city was left without power.
Wherever Russia goes, it brings only destruction and death. Footage is being published online from Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, captured by the Russian Federation, of which literally nothing remains. The Sunday Times has begun analyzing the situation on the battlefield in the event of a possible loss of Pokrovsk and the neighboring Mirnograd. Journalists report that fighting in the northeast will continue as the fortified cities of the Donetsk region are still being held.
At the moment, the main fighting in the city is concentrated around the meat processing plant, the feed mill, and the Dinas residential district. Ukraine's defense forces are holding the multi-story district, which is essentially the commanding heights. Holding this district effectively means controlling a significant part of Pokrovsk. Therefore, to talk about the capture of the city in the near future, as some Western media outlets report, is at the very least premature.
The situation remains stable on another hot front, the Kupiansk direction.
At the moment, operational reserves of the Ukrainian defense forces have been deployed to the Kupiansk direction, which has significantly stabilized the situation. Moreover, according to the Russian side's own assessments, a significant part of Kupiansk is under the control of the Ukrainian defense forces.
Marks for 6 downed cruise missiles were spotted on a French Mirage, which is defending Ukrainian skies. The Air Force showcased the fighter jet in action. It has been said more than once that Russia will not stop its war in Ukraine. The German defense minister named a specific date, 2029, when the Kremlin will start a war with NATO. Russia quickly activated its defensive response accusations and declared that now there is no doubt who the aggressor is.
There are constant provocations by the Russian army on the Russian-Estonian border near Narva. Narva is a city where 90% of the population is Russian-speaking, and it is separated from the Russian Federation only by a river. And the Russian political and military elites believe that it is Estonia that will become the Achilles heel of the NATO bloc in the event of a possible Russian invasion directly into the territory of the Baltic states.
While Russia does not justify the wars it has started, everyone else is preparing to repel their attacks. Finland has started artillery exercises just 100 kilometers from the Russian border. More than 2,000 military personnel and 500 pieces of equipment are taking part in them.
Ukraine's ground forces have released horrifying footage from Konstantinivka, a city that Russian forces are literally erasing from the face of the earth. Around 5,000 civilians still remain in the city. Every day, the enemy drops guide bombs directly onto residential neighborhoods. Fierce fighting continues in Kupiansk. In our next segment, we'll take you to this critical section of the front, where Ukrainian defenders are holding the line against Russian assaults.
By November 15th, that was the deadline set by the Russian dictator Putin for the capture of Kupiansk. However, the Russian army once again missed its own deadlines and failed to take control of the city. This was stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Currently, Ukrainian units are holding key heights and settlements both in Kupiansk and around the city.
At the moment, the situation in Kupiansk has been largely stabilized.
There, Ukrainian forces continue an active operation to destroy Russian units in the northern part of the city, where the enemy has been cut off from its main supply lines.
I wouldn't say it's very easy, but considering that they are cut off from their main supplies and cannot receive effective reinforcements now, they are currently in a much worse situation than the Ukrainian defenders were even at their lowest point.
To strengthen the defense in the Kupiansk direction, operational reserves have been deployed, including special operations units with experience in urban combat.
In addition, it was possible to a significant extent stabilize the situation in the direction of Kupiansk-Uzlovy. This is a key railway station which the occupiers are trying to break through to. They are in dire need of control over this particular logistical component of Ukraine's defense forces in order to use the short logistics route to create a strike group in this direction, which would aim to advance further towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk along the Oskil River.
And of course, what would it be without Russian fakes? Another masterpiece from the Kremlin. According to the Joint Forces Group, the occupiers have been ordered to film staged videos waving the tricolor flag in places where, in reality, only small groups of infantry are present. Flags have even started to be included in supply packages that drones drop to Russian units in the city. At least one such operation has already taken place. But in reality, this stunt played into the hands of the Ukrainian defenders. It became much easier for operators to detect and destroy the enemy.
Recently, the Russians received an order. We started dropping flags to them, and they began waving those flags to show that they were supposedly in the city and to prove that Putin and the general staff weren't lying. But nevertheless, despite all this, these flags clearly reveal the positions from which they are being waved. So they are trading the real presence of Russians in the northern districts of the city for a fake one. Well, this is actually somewhat typical of Russian propaganda, but still.
At the same time, the occupiers have sharply intensified their activity in the area of Milove in the Kharkiv region. There, the enemy wants to create a wide so-called buffer zone from Milov to Kupiansk and further to Vovchansk.
In other words, the occupiers plan to expand the area of their presence in order to create a precedent for the so-called exchange of territories. That is, they will propose Kupiansk, the Kupiansk districts, and Vovchansk in exchange, respectively, for the withdrawal of Ukrainian units from the areas of Donetsk region under their control.
In Kupiansk, the enemy continues to use scorched earth tactics. This involves the use of army and frontline aviation, as well as strikes with guided aerial bombs on residential neighborhoods of the city, plus the use of the heavy flamethrower system Solntsepyok.
This is a thermobaric weapon, which is strictly prohibited for use in urban areas due to its highly indiscriminate effects. This restriction exists to emphasize the risk these weapons pose.
And while the occupying army is looking for ways to capture Kupiansk, their massive assaults and rotations and constant pressure are not yielding the desired results. The majority of the city remains firmly under the control of Ukrainian defense forces, while the Russians are losing dozens of their soldiers every day.
Ukraine's Air Force has released video of a French Mirage 2000 fighter jet taking off on a combat mission. Let me remind you, Ukraine received its first batch of French Mirages in early February 2025. At the time, officials did not disclose how many aircraft were delivered. And just yesterday, President Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron signed a major defense agreement, which includes the future sale of up to 100 Rafale fighter jets to Ukraine by the year 2035. Coming up, more on the latest developments in weapons deliveries and defense production for Ukraine.
Kyiv is becoming the world's center for combat drone production. Currently, Ukraine produces up to 4 million combat UAVs annually. Meanwhile, the US manufactures less than 100,000 combat drones per year. And 4 million is not the limit of the capabilities of the Ukrainian defense industry. With sufficient funding, this number could increase several times over. This was written on his page by Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha.
The current arms race isn't about nuclear weapons, but about millions of cheap drones. Whoever can ramp up production faster will secure peace. With sufficient funding, we can produce up to 20 million drones next year. Andriy Sybiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Right now, Ukraine is racing against time, both in terms of resources and technology. And the issue of increasing UAV production is a matter of survival. Ukrainian companies not only meet the needs of the defense forces, but are also trying to enter international markets. Unique technologies tested in real combat conditions are attracting serious interest from partners. Some Ukrainian companies have already expanded their production, not only within Ukraine, but also beyond its borders.
Ukrainian companies in Europe. Skaton has opened a facility in Slovakia and attracted over 10 million euros in investment. Flywell is preparing a joint production venture with Finland. Firepoint has received support from Denmark for the development of rocket fuel for the Flamingo cruise missile systems.
The Ukrainian company CIR is setting up a production line in Finland. Its founder, Oleksandr Hrachov, explained in an interview with Bloomberg that he is pursuing two goals in Finland. First, to ensure reliable supply to the front in Ukraine by moving part of the production capacity outside the combat zone. And second, to attract Western funding to expand production.
The war and the need to finance, develop and manufacture weapons to fight a wealthier and larger adversary have pushed Ukrainian manufacturers to exchange technologies with their European allies. Hrachov is concerned that Europe is not learning quickly enough from Ukraine's experience. In the time it took him to set up a production line in Finland, his drones in Ukraine have already gone through 3 generations.
Not only the production of drones abroad, but also the assistance of our European partners is a key to victory in the war against Russia. Without exaggeration, a historic agreement was signed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron.
I want to emphasize the importance of this agreement. This is a strategic agreement that will be in effect for 10 years starting next year. We understand all the fundamentals of this agreement, political, financial and industrial. This is a historic agreement. It is extremely valuable that France is taking such a step toward achieving real guaranteed security in Europe.
Under the terms of the agreement, Ukraine will acquire 100 Rafale F-4 aircraft from France by 2035 for Ukraine's combat aviation. SAMP-T air defense systems, radars for them, air-to-air missiles and aerial bombs. Also, already this year, joint projects between the defense industries of the two countries will begin. This concerns the joint production of interceptor drones and work on developing critical technologies for Ukrainian UAVs. Strengthening its own air defense and carrying out systematic deep strikes on Russian infrastructure are the keys to a successful end to the war for Ukraine.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now is the perfect time to subscribe to the channel, like this video and share it with others. Please do it right now. Thank you and glory to Ukraine. Russian forces launched attacks on Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk and Chernihiv regions. In the Kharkiv region, it around 10 private homes. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is predicting that the war in Ukraine will end in 2026. This information was reported by Euronews, citing an internal European Commission document obtained by journalists. The document outlines possible mechanisms for long-term financial support to Kyiv, with the main source of funds being revenues generated from frozen Russian assets. Interestingly, von der Leyen is not the first to name 2026 as the potential end of Russia's war. Earlier, Chief Rabbi of Dnipro, Shmuel Kamenetsky, also pointed to that very year. There are at least 2 ways to interpret this. Either both von der Leyen and Rabbi Kamenetsky have access to certain information, perhaps diplomatic signals or intelligence that leads them to this conclusion, or they simply don't know for sure. But they're choosing to be optimistic. Either way, 2026 is just around the corner. We'll soon find out. Right now, international media is actively discussing the possibility for a direct meeting between President Zelensky and dictator Putin. There are growing suggestions that such a meeting could take place in Turkey. Ankara remains a key international player, and President Erdogan is one of the few world leaders who still maintains direct communication with Moscow.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Turkey makes a bold statement. Peace in Ukraine is not just a goal, but an inevitability.
We are working on ending the war. I hope you will all see it soon.
Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said in an interview with Ahaba that even those who did not want the war to end are starting to think differently.
The war must end. We believe negotiations are inevitable. Personally, I believe that negotiations will resume. Of course, we cannot go into details. This could happen in Turkey, or it could happen somewhere else. But I believe that this peace will definitely come.
According to him, for 3 or 4 years, there were forces that actively prevented the end of the war. And now a classic turning point has come. These groups are changing their position. Fidan calls the war a war of attrition, where neither side can emerge victorious and the losses are enormous, human, economic and political.
Of course, the war must end. That has been our policy from the very beginning. But in America and Europe, there were very influential groups that did not want this to stop.
He also emphasizes diplomacy remains the main path to peace. Turkey believes in creating a peace platform, possibly on its own territory. At the same time, Fidan does not reveal all the details for obvious reasons, but he says directly, peace is not only necessary, but inevitable.
Right now, we are living through the darkest moment because both sides are focused on destroying each other's transport and energy infrastructure. They are striking military targets and have reached a stalemate. Now it has turned into a drone war.
In addition, the minister notes the serious burden the war places on European countries. Funding military aid is destabilizing budgets. Money is being spent not only on defense, education, healthcare, and infrastructure are suffering.
The European side is not actively participating in the war by sending troops, but it is constantly involved in the war with its money and support. And that comes at a high price, the blockade of Russia. You don't buy energy, you don't trade with it, with Russia. You have to pay for that.
However, Fidan also sees obstacles. According to him, the main one remains the status of the Donbas territory, specifically control over the territories of the so-called DPR. He warns that any settlement must be realistic, taking into account the situation on the front and the interests of both sides. At the same time, Turkey is ready to play an active role. Fidan states that Ankara will not refuse any role in the peace process and that negotiations must be long-term and effective.
Winter is ahead of us. What we are seeing now, in fact, we have all the conditions for peace, for a ceasefire.
If we are to believe the Turkish Foreign Ministry, right now may be the closest point to a halt in the fighting, to a shift toward diplomacy.
I think this war is now going through its worst phase, because both sides are focused on destroying transport and energy infrastructure. Now it has turned into a drone war. No one can move anywhere. The only ones advancing are those who don't care about losses.
An important warning from Fidan: a peace platform is possible, but unpleasant decisions, including territorial ones, may be part of a future agreement.
In the event of a peace agreement with Russia, Ukrainian armed forces could help protect the eastern borders of the European Union against future Russian aggression. This was stated by Andrius Kubilius, the European Commissioner for Defense. However, he emphasized that this scenario remains a very distant prospect for now. But Kubilius also spoke about more immediate possibilities, warning that Russia could attack a NATO country within the next 2 to 4 years. The most likely target, he said, would be one of the Baltic states. According to General Wiesław Kukula, chief of the Polish General Staff, the enemy has already entered a preparatory phase for war. It's actively shaping an environment that could create favorable conditions for a potential act of aggression against Poland. Specifically, the general pointed to cyber attacks and sabotage operations on Polish territory as clear sign of this build-up. Now, who exactly is meant by the enemy? I'll take a guess, Russia, but I wouldn't put my words directly into General Kukula's mouth. And finally, a story about Russia's richest spy, after Putin, of course. Patrushev. Once a relatively low-profile government official, he has now become a multi-billionaire. How did that happen? The answer in our next report.
This is how we drink, yeah. We found a puddle in the trench, we're scooping it up. Look how many leeches there are. So we drink however we can, we'll figure it out later.
Our command abandoned us. We've been sitting here for 2 months without food, without supplies,